He laughed at her on stage for being blind, but in just a few seconds he couldn't believe his eyes. Michael Reynolds adjusted his tie for the third time as he watched the technicians put the finishing touches on the main stage of Lincoln Center. The benefit concert to raise funds for Children's Hope Hospital was scheduled for next week, but the biggest problem still remained unsolved. That's when he saw a young woman with long brown hair step onto the stage, carrying a small leather bag. She walked slowly, lightly feeling her way with one hand toward the grand piano that dominated the center of the stage. "Excuse me, miss," said Michael, climbing the side steps. "The theater is closed for private rehearsals today." The woman stopped and turned toward the voice, her eyes not quite focusing on where he stood. "Good afternoon. My name is Emily Parker. I'm here for the pianist audition for the benefit concert." Michael's stomach twisted. Another desperate pianist trying to land the job. Over the past 2 weeks, he had dismissed 3 professionals who simply couldn't keep up with the demanding pace of his performances. "Look, Emily, right? I think there's been some misunderstanding. I need an experienced pianist, someone who—" He paused, studying her face more closely. "Are you all right? You don't seem to be looking at me properly." "I've been blind since I was 15, Emily replied simply, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "But that doesn't stop me from playing the piano. In fact, it might even help." A heavy silence fell over the theater. The technicians adjusting the lights stopped their work to watch the scene unfold. Michael felt a mix of disbelief and irritation rising inside him. "You must be joking," he said with a bitter laugh. "How exactly is someone who can't see the keys supposed to accompany a lyric singer during a live performance?" Emily took a deep breath, keeping her composure. She had faced this kind of reaction many times before. "Mr. Reynolds, I've listened to your recordings. I know the entire repertoire for the concert. I can play any of the pieces from memory." "From memory?" Michael laughed again, louder this time. "My dear, this isn't a school recital. It's a fundraiser for a children's hospital. Hundreds of important people will be in the audience. Do you really think I'd risk my reputation with a—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "With someone who obviously has limitations." The technicians exchanged uncomfortable glances. Charles, the theater director, who had been reviewing some documents backstage, heard the raised voices and approached. "What's the problem here?" Charles asked, stepping onto the stage. "Director, please tell me this is a joke," Michael said, gesturing toward Emily. "They sent a blind pianist for the audition." "Blind? How is she supposed to read the sheet music? How will she know when to come in? How can she follow along if I decide to improvise during the performance?" Emily felt her face grow warm but kept her voice steady. "Mr. Reynolds, I have perfect pitch. I can identify any note, any chord, any variation you make. And as for the sheet music, I've already memorized the entire concert program." "Perfect pitch?" Michael scoffed. "Now you're just lying outright to get the job. That's rare. Not something just anyone has." Charles watched the situation with growing discomfort. He knew Michael Reynolds' reputation, an undeniable talent, but with a difficult temper that had caused problems before. "Michael, why not let her audition?" the director suggested. "If it doesn't work out, we'll find someone else." "I'm not wasting my time on this," Michael replied, crossing his arms. "I've already wasted 2 weeks looking for a competent pianist. The concert is in 6 days." Emily took a step forward, locating the piano by the sound of her words echoing in the room. "Give me 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes." "Emily, I'm not sure that's a good idea," Charles said gently. "Michael is right about the complexity of the performance." "5 minutes," she repeated, already walking toward the instrument. "If I don't convince you, I'll leave and never come back." Michael crossed his arms, determined to show how ridiculous the situation was. When Emily sat at the piano, he chose one of the most difficult pieces in the repertoire. "Play the second movement of Mozart's sonata in B-flat major. The version we're using for the concert has some modifications I made myself." Emily placed her hands on the keys. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes filled the theater with crystalline purity. Her fingers moved across the keys with a precision that surprised even the most experienced technicians. But what impressed them most was when she played exactly the modifications Michael had mentioned, modifications he had never recorded or published anywhere. Michael felt his jaw slacken. How could she know arrangements he had only just recently made? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. Emily finished the piece and kept her hands on the keys for a moment, waiting for a reaction. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't discomfort, it was admiration. "How do you know these modifications?" Michael asked, his voice losing some of its earlier arrogance. "I was here during your rehearsals last week," Emily replied. "I work part-time organizing the theater's music archives. I heard you testing those variations." Charles smiled, now remembering seeing Emily a few times in the theater's hallways. She had recently been hired to help organize the music archives, a job she could do perfectly well despite her visual impairment. "You work here?" Michael asked, still trying to process what he had just heard. "Just a few hours a week. I need the money for piano lessons." "Even so," Michael said, regaining some of his defensive stance, "playing a piece from memory is one thing. Accompanying a live singer is completely different. It requires constant adaptation, immediate response to my changes in tempo, in intensity." "Then test me," Emily challenged. Michael hesitated for a moment, then stepped onto the small stage where he would stand during the performance. He chose an aria he knew was particularly demanding, one that required several tempo changes. "Schubert's Ave Maria, but I'll sing it my way. You'll have to follow me." He began at a slower tempo than usual, expecting Emily to falter, but when she joined in on the piano, she was perfectly in sync. Michael suddenly sped up during the second verse. Emily followed without hesitation. He inserted a dramatic pause mid-phrase. She held the corresponding note for exactly the right amount of time. As the music progressed, Michael realized he was focusing more on his own singing than ever before. Emily wasn't just accompanying him. She seemed to anticipate his musical intentions, creating a harmonic foundation that enhanced every nuance of his voice. When the final note echoed through the theater, the technicians burst into spontaneous applause. Michael stood still, staring at Emily with an expression that mixed surprise and something he didn't want to admit: respect. "That was fine," he finally said, trying to maintain his earlier coldness. Charles approached Emily with a genuine smile. "Emily, you're hired. The pay will be the same as we agreed with the other candidates." "Wait a minute," Michael protested. "I haven't agreed to work with her yet." "Michael," Charles said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "the concert is in 6 days. Every other pianist in the city is already booked for other events. Emily is our best option." "Best option? She's blind, Charles. How will she know when I look at her for cues? How will she notice if something goes wrong on stage?" Emily rose from the piano bench, her dignity intact despite the harsh words. "Mr. Reynolds, I understand your concerns, but I can assure you, my hearing is sharper than any musician you've ever worked with. I can hear your breathing and know when you're about to start a phrase. I can hear the tension in your voice and sense if you need harmonic support. I can hear things eyes can't see." "Pretty words," Michael replied, "but words don't guarantee a flawless performance." "Then let's rehearse," Emily suggested. "If you're not satisfied with my performance by the day of the concert, I'll step aside voluntarily." Charles looked at Michael, waiting for a response. The singer knew he was cornered. There wasn't enough time to find another competent pianist, and he reluctantly had to admit Emily had played better than any of the previous candidates. "Fine," he said at last, "but I want rehearsals every morning until the concert, and if you disrupt my performance in any way, it'll be the last time you play in this theater." Emily nodded. "Thank you for the opportunity." As she gathered her things, Michael remained on stage, watching her move carefully but without hesitation. There was something about her that unsettled him, and it wasn't just her blindness. It was her quiet confidence, the way she had handled his provocations without losing composure. "Charles," he said once Emily had left, "are you sure she's really up for this?" "Michael, In 20 years of running this theatre, I've never seen a pianist play with such sensitivity. And you know it." Michael didn't respond, but something inside him resisted the idea of admitting Emily was truly talented. The next day, Emily arrived at the theatre promptly at 9 in the morning. Michael was already there, warming up by the auxiliary piano backstage. When she stepped onto the main stage, he stopped what he was doing and watched as she made her way to the grand piano. "Good morning," Emily said, pulling a small folder from her bag. "What's that?" Michael asked, pointing to it. "My Braille scores. I like to review before playing, even when I know the music by heart." Michael stepped closer, curious despite himself. He had never seen Braille sheet music up close. The tiny raised dots looked like an indecipherable code to him. "How do you read this so fast?" "Practice," Emily answered simply. "Just like reading regular words. After a while, you don't think about each letter. You just understand the meaning." She ran her fingers swiftly over a few pages, mentally reviewing the more complex passages. "Which piece should we start with?" she asked. "Nessun dorma. It's always the one with the most technical challenges." Emily positioned herself at the piano and waited for his cue. Michael took a deep breath and began to sing. This time, he deliberately made things harder, shifting tempos abruptly and pausing in unconventional places. He wanted to see just how well she could keep up. To his frustration, Emily responded to every change with perfect precision. Not only that, she seemed to anticipate his intentions, preparing harmonies that supported his interpretive choices, even before he consciously decided to make them. During the pause in the middle of the aria, Michael stopped singing entirely, expecting Emily to keep playing and create an awkward moment. Instead, she stopped at the exact same instant, resting her hands on the keys in complete silence. "How did you know I was going to stop?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "I felt your breathing change, and the echo of your voice in the theatre, and everyone has a different pattern. Yours tells me when you're about to pause." Michael felt a strange mix of admiration and irritation. On one hand, it was impressive to work with someone so technically skilled. On the other, he was used to being the absolute center of attention during his performances, and Emily was proving to be a far stronger presence than he'd expected. "Let's try Ave Maria again," he said. "This time I want you to play exactly as written, no improvisations." Emily nodded and began the introduction. Michael came in on time but deliberately sang a half step below the written pitch, hoping she'd falter and try to correct him. Instead, she smoothly transitioned to the key he'd chosen, matching him perfectly at the new pitch. When Michael realized she hadn't fallen for the trick, he tried shifting back to the original key mid-song. Again, Emily adjusted almost imperceptibly. By the end of the piece, Michael was visibly frustrated. "Why did you change the key?" "Because you changed it first," Emily replied calmly. "My job is to accompany you, not correct you. I didn't change anything on purpose. I'm sorry, Mr. Reynolds, but you did. You started in G major and then dropped to F-sharp major. I thought it was an artistic choice." Michael fell silent for a moment. Emily was right, and they both knew it. He had deliberately tested her skill, and she had passed brilliantly. "Let's take a break," he said abruptly. "I'll be back in 15 minutes." He left the stage, leaving Emily alone. Backstage, he found Charles talking to Rebecca, the lead violinist of the small orchestra accompanying the concert. "How are rehearsals going?" Charles asked. "She's competent," Michael replied without enthusiasm. "Competent?" Rebecca smiled. "Michael, I heard you two playing from outside. That girl isn't just competent, she's extraordinary. It's been years since I've heard a pianist with that much talent." "It's just technique," Michael said defensively. "Real talent requires much more than that." Rebecca gave him a strange look. "Michael, are you all right? You're usually the first to recognize real musical talent." He didn't answer, but went to his private dressing room to warm up for the next rehearsal. When he returned to the stage, he found Emily still at the piano. But this time she was playing something different. A delicate, melancholic composition he didn't immediately recognize, with a melodic line that seemed to tell a wordless story. She played with her eyes closed, completely absorbed. "What is that?" he asked when she finished. "My own composition," Emily replied. a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Sorry, I know I should be rehearsing the concert repertoire. You compose?" "A little, in my spare time." Michael felt another pang of that inexplicable irritation. As if being an exceptional performer wasn't enough, Emily was also a composer. "Let's get back to work," he said sharply. "The concert is in 5 days, and we still have a lot to rehearse." The rest of the morning passed in relative professional silence. Emily performed each piece of the repertoire flawlessly, adapting to every change Michael made without showing any difficulty. But there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before, as if something unspoken lingered between them. When the rehearsal ended, Emily put away her Braille sheet music and prepared to leave. "Emily," Michael called out as she was almost at the stage exit. "Yes?" "Tomorrow I want to start earlier, 8 in the morning." "Of course. See you tomorrow, Mr. Reynolds." After she left, Michael remained alone on stage for a few minutes. There was something about Emily that deeply unsettled him, but he couldn't quite pinpoint what. Maybe it was the way she seemed so self-assured despite her disability. Maybe it was how she had handled his attempts to unsettle her, or perhaps it was simply the fact that, for the first time in years, he was working with someone who could be considered his equal in musical talent. That evening in his Upper East Side apartment, Michael couldn't stop thinking about the rehearsal. He sat at his private piano and tried to play the composition Emily had performed earlier, but he couldn't recall the exact melody. This only irritated him further. He picked up the phone and called Charles. "Do you know anything about Emily's past?" he asked without preamble. "Good evening to you too, Michael," Charles replied with amusement. "Why the question?" "Just professional curiosity. She has an unusual talent for someone so young." "Well, I know she studied at Juilliard for a few years, and I believe she had private lessons with some prominent teachers here in New York." "What kind of teachers?" "Michael, why the sudden interest? This morning you wanted to get rid of her." "I just want to make sure she's qualified for the concert." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "If you want my opinion, Emily is more qualified than any pianist you've ever worked with, and you know it." After hanging up, Michael remained restless. There was something about Emily's playing that stirred vague memories, as if he'd heard that style before, but he couldn't place where or when. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now continuing, the next day Emily arrived at the theatre a few minutes before 8. She found Michael already warming up his voice, but this time he wasn't alone. An older woman with silver hair tied in an elegant bun sat in the front row of the audience. "Good morning," Emily said as she approached the stage. "Emily, this is Margaret Parker, our veteran pianist," Michael said. "She'll be observing today's rehearsal." Emily froze halfway to the piano, a strange premonition washing over her. "Parker?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes," the older woman replied, standing and walking toward the stage. "And you must be the Emily I've heard so much about." Emily turned pale. "Mom?" The silence that followed was broken only by the echo of the word in the vast theatre. Michael looked from one to the other, confused. "You two know each other?" he asked. Margaret stepped onto the stage with slow movements, her eyes fixed on the daughter she hadn't seen in over 2 years. "Emily, my child, what are you doing here?" "I work here, Mom, and I'm performing in the benefit concert." "No, this can't be happening," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "You promised you wouldn't pursue a music career anymore." Michael watched the scene with growing interest. There was clearly a story here he didn't know. "Excuse me," he interrupted, "but could someone tell me what's going on?" Margaret looked at him with tear-filled eyes. "Mr. Reynolds, this is my daughter Emily, and I've come here today to ask you not to let her perform in the concert." "Mom, please don't do this," Emily pleaded. "Do what exactly?" Michael asked, his curiosity piqued. Margaret took a deep breath before answering. Emily had a promising career when she was younger. She performed at many important events, had a bright future ahead of her. But 3 years ago, she hesitated. There was an accident. What kind of accident? She was performing at Boston Symphony Hall. During the concert, there were issues with the stage lighting. Emily tripped while leaving the stage and fell from a considerable height. The head injury resulted in the loss of her vision. Emily felt the tears burning her eyes. It was the first time she had heard the story told so directly, so raw. After that, Margaret continued, Emily didn't play for 2 years. She fell into a deep depression, thought her life was over. When she finally started to recover, I convinced her to take a different path, a safer one. She was studying to become a music teacher. But Mom, I can't just give up what I love, Emily said, her voice trembling. You could get hurt again. You could face more humiliation. Don't you see how some musicians treat people with disabilities? Michael felt a growing discomfort. Margaret's words echoed his own attitude over the past few days. Mrs. Parker, he said, Emily has proven herself very capable in rehearsals. Capable? Margaret laughed bitterly. Mr. Reynolds, my daughter was considered a prodigy. By 12, she was playing pieces professional pianists found challenging. She doesn't just need to be capable, she needs to be extraordinary to make up for her disability, and that will put terrible pressure on her. I can handle the pressure, Emily said firmly. Like that time in Boston? Do you remember what happened before the accident? You were so nervous you nearly fainted during the first piece. Michael watched the exchange with renewed focus. There were more layers to this story than he had imagined. Mrs. Parker, he said, with all due respect, the decision should be Emily's. You don't understand, Margaret replied, tears beginning to stream down her face. When Emily lost her sight, I lost a part of myself too. Watching my daughter struggle with simple daily tasks, seeing her trip, get hurt, grow frustrated, I can't go through that again. Emily stepped closer to her mother and took her hands. Mom, I know you're afraid. So am I. But I can't spend the rest of my life hiding. Music is who I am, with or without sight. What if something goes wrong during the concert? What if you lose your place in the middle of a piece? It will be humiliating, Emily. Then I'll face the humiliation, Emily replied. But I won't give up without trying. Michael felt something shift inside him, a mix of reluctant admiration and guilt. The harsh words he had directed at Emily over the past few days seemed to echo differently now that he knew part of her story. Mrs. Parker, he said, his voice softer than usual, I can assure you Emily has more than enough talent for this concert. In fact, she's better than any pianist I've ever worked with. Margaret looked at him in surprise. Better, even being blind. Especially being blind, Michael replied, surprising himself with his sincerity. Her hearing is extraordinary. She picks up nuances in the music most people don't even notice. Emily turned her face toward him, clearly startled by the unexpected praise. But what if she gets hurt? Margaret insisted. Mum, it's been 3 years since I learned to manage on my own. I won't trip on stage. How can you be sure? It was Charles who answered, appearing from the side of the stage where he had been listening to the conversation. Because we'll make sure the stage is completely safe, and because Emily knows every inch of this theatre. Margaret looked around as if seeing the place for the first time. This is the theatre where you work organizing archives? Yes, Mom, and where I rehearse in my free time. I know every step, every curve, every echo of this place. Margaret fell silent for several minutes, clearly wrestling with herself. Are you sure you want to do this? She finally asked. More sure than I've ever been about anything in my life. And you? Margaret turned to Michael. Are you certain my daughter won't be humiliated on stage? Michael looked at Emily, remembering how she had handled all his attempts to unsettle her in recent days, remembering how she had played with such sensitivity and technical precision. Mrs. Parker, I can promise your daughter will be the star of this concert. The words left his mouth before he could think them through, but as soon as he said them, he knew they were true. Margaret took a deep breath. All right, but I'll stay and watch the rehearsals. If I think Emily is suffering too much, I'll ask her to stop. Emily smiled for the first time since her mother had arrived. Thank you, Mom. Now, said Charles, shall we start rehearsing? We have a lot of work ahead. Margaret sat in the front row while Emily and Michael returned to their positions. But there was something different in the air now. The hostile tension from before had been replaced by something more complex, a mix of mutual understanding and professional challenge. "Let's begin with Nessun Dorma," said Michael. Emily placed her hands on the keys and waited for his cue. When Michael began to sing, she immediately noticed something different in his voice. There was more emotion, more vulnerability than before. As the music progressed, Emily felt she was part of something more than just a rehearsal. It was as if Michael wasn't just singing the words of the opera, but also his own doubts and fears. When they reached the aria's climax, Michael did something he had never done before. He looked directly at Emily as he sang. Though she couldn't see his gaze, she somehow felt its intensity through the music. The final note echoed through the theater, followed by deep silence. Then Margaret began to clap, tears streaming freely down her face. "My daughter," she said, her voice breaking, "you're playing like never before." Emily smiled, feeling something she hadn't in years, the sense that she was exactly where she belonged. Michael watched the scene quietly. Something had changed during that performance, something he couldn't name but knew was important. "Let's continue," he said, but his voice carried a new respect when he spoke to Emily. The rest of the rehearsal flowed with a smoothness none of them had experienced before. Each piece felt more natural, more expressive. Michael stopped trying to test Emily and began truly making music with her. When they finished, Margaret approached the stage. "Can I speak with both of you for a moment?" They stepped down and sat in the front row of the audience. "Emily," Margaret began, "I never told you the whole truth about the accident in Boston." Emily's heart raced. "What do you mean?" "The problem wasn't just with the stage lighting. There was an incident with the lead singer before the performance." "What kind of incident?" Margaret hesitated, glancing briefly at Michael before continuing. "He had been drinking before the concert, and during the intermission, he made very harsh comments about your age, said you were just a little girl trying to show off, said he was going to make you humiliate yourself on stage." Emily felt her blood run cold. "You never told me that. I didn't want you to carry that hurt, but I think you have the right to know that your fall wasn't just because of the lighting. You were crying when you left the stage. You were too upset to watch where you were going." Michael felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. The similarities between that singer's behavior and his own actions over the past few days were impossible to ignore. "Why are you telling me this now?" Emily asked. "Because I want you to know that this time is different. Mr. Reynolds may have been harsh at first, but I saw how he sang with you today. I saw the respect in his eyes. That's something you've never had before." Emily turned her face toward Michael, as if she could see him through the music they'd made together. "Is it true?" she asked. "Do you respect me as a musician?" Michael was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "Emily, I owe you an apology. Over the last 48 hours, I've behaved inexcusably. I let my prejudices speak louder than my professional judgment. And now I realize you're not just a good pianist, you're an exceptional artist, and it will be an honor to share the stage with you." Margaret smiled through her tears. "Then I think I can go home in peace. But Emily, promise me one thing." "What, Mom?" "If you ever feel like music is bringing you more pain than joy, promise me you'll stop." "I promise." Margaret kissed her daughter's forehead and headed toward the theater exit. Before leaving, she stopped and looked at Michael. "Mr. Reynolds, take good care of my daughter." "You have my word, Mrs. Parker." After Margaret left, Emily and Michael were alone in the theater. A heavy silence hung between them, as if both were processing everything that had happened. "Can I ask you something?" Michael finally said. "Of course. How did you handle all of it? Losing your sight, the depression, returning to music. How did you manage to be so strong?" Emily was thoughtful for a moment. "I suppose I didn't have a choice. When I woke up in the hospital and found out I was blind, my first thought was that my life was over. I spent 2 years believing that." "What changed?" "One day I was alone at home and heard my mother crying in her room. She thought I couldn't hear, but she cried every day. That's when I realized my sadness wasn't just affecting me." Michael listened in silence. "So I started trying to play the piano again. At first, my hands shook so badly I could barely hit the keys, but little by little, I remembered that music never needed my eyes. It always came from the heart. And you weren't afraid to return to the stage? Terrified, I still am, but I've learned that fear only becomes a problem when we let it control our decisions. Michael nodded, thinking of his own fears. Fear of sharing the spotlight, fear of being overshadowed, fear of admitting when someone was better than him. Emily, can I tell you something? Of course. I have fears too, and I think that's what made me treat you poorly these past few days. What kind of fears? Michael hesitated. He wasn't used to opening up like this. Fear that you were a better pianist than anyone I've ever worked with. Fear that the audience would pay more attention to you than to me. Fear of admitting that maybe I needed to learn a few things from you. Emily smiled sadly. Mr. Reynolds, music isn't a competition, it's collaboration. I know, at least my mind knows, but my ego takes longer to accept. They laughed together, and for the first time since they'd met, there was no tension between them. How about we rehearse one more song before we leave? Emily suggested. Which one would you like to play? The one you always end your concerts with. Con te partirò. Michael smiled. It was his favorite song, the one he saved for the most special moments. How did you know it was my favorite? By the way you hummed it during breaks these past few days. Your favorites always slip out even when you don't notice. They stepped onto the stage again. This time there was no test, no challenge, just two musicians doing what they loved most. When Michael began singing Con te partirò, Emily felt like she was part of something sacred. His voice carried all the emotions he'd held onto for years: love, loss, hope, longing. And for the first time since the accident, Emily felt she was truly making music again. Not just playing the right notes, but creating something new and beautiful with another human being. When the song ended, they both stood in silence for several minutes. "Thank you," Michael finally said. "For what?" "For reminding me why I started singing." Emily smiled. "Thank you for letting me be part of it." As they prepared to leave, Michael had one last question. "Emily, do you think your mother was right about me having respect in my eyes?" "I don't know. I can't see your eyes, but I can hear it in your voice. And your voice has changed a lot since that first day." "How so?" "On the first day, you sang like you were trying to prove something. Today, you sang like you were sharing something." Michael reflected on this as he walked home. Emily had summed up in a few words something it had taken him years to understand about himself. That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept soundly. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The next 3 days of rehearsal flew by. The dynamic between Emily and Michael had completely changed. Where there had once been tension and competitiveness, there was now a true partnership. They experimented with musical variations together, discussed interpretations, and Michael genuinely began to value Emily's suggestions. "What if you slowed the tempo a bit in the second verse?" Emily suggested during one rehearsal. "It would add more drama to the build-up." "Good idea," Michael replied, genuinely interested in her input. Charles watched from the wings with satisfaction. In 20 years of directing the theatre, he'd rarely seen a musical partnership form so organically. "They're going to put on a memorable show," he remarked to Rebecca, the violinist. "If they can keep this energy until tomorrow," Rebecca replied. "Michael always gets nervous before big concerts." Sure enough, on the morning of the concert, Michael arrived at the theatre visibly anxious. Emily was already there, warming up at the piano when he walked in. "How do you stay so calm?" he asked, beginning his vocal exercises. "Who said I'm calm?" Emily laughed. "I'm terrified, but I've learned not to let fear control my fingers. What if something goes wrong? If I forget the lyrics, if you lose your place in the music, then we improvise. The music always finds a way to continue." That afternoon, they held their final dress rehearsal. The small orchestra was present, along with Rebecca and the other musicians who would join them for the concert. Everything went perfectly, but Michael couldn't shake his anxiety. Michael, Emily said during a break, can I ask you a personal question? Of course. Why is music so important to you? He grew thoughtful for a moment. I think it's the only thing I truly know how to do well, and it's the only way I have to genuinely connect with other people. Then stop worrying about whether it'll go wrong. Focus on the connection. 2 hours before the concert, the theatre began to fill. Emily was in the dressing room she shared with Rebecca, listening to the sounds of the arriving audience. Quite a crowd out there, Rebecca remarked. How do you know I'm nervous? Emily asked. Because you've been playing the same passage on the piano for 15 minutes. Emily laughed and stopped playing. It's different from anything I've ever done. Before the accident, I mostly played alone. I never had to rely so much on someone else. And do you trust Michael? Emily thought for a moment. I trust the musician he is. As for the rest, well, we'll see. In the next dressing room, Michael was having a very different conversation with Charles. Are you sure she can handle this? He asked for the 10th time. Michael, in all these years, have you ever known me to misjudge a musician? No, but then trust me, and more importantly, trust her. Michael knew Charles was right, but he couldn't shake a strange feeling of vulnerability. For the first time in his career, his success depended as much on someone else as it did on himself. 30 minutes before the start, Emily received an unexpected visitor. Margaret appeared at the dressing room door carrying a small bouquet of flowers. "Mom!" Emily exclaimed, standing to hug her. "I couldn't miss it. I know how important this moment is for you." "Thank you for being here." Margaret handed the flowers to her daughter. "These are the same flowers you carried at your first recital, when you were 8, remember?" Emily felt her eyes fill with tears. She remembered perfectly. It had been at the same Lincoln Center where she stood now, in a concert for young talents. "I do. You were so nervous that day. You threw up 3 times before going on stage. But when you started playing, it was magic. What if tonight isn't magic? It will be. Because you're not that 8-year-old girl playing to impress adults anymore. You're a woman who plays because you need to, because it's who you are." Emily hugged her mother tightly. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, my dear. Now go make history." 15 minutes before the start, Emily and Michael met backstage. She looked elegant in her simple black dress, he impeccable in his tuxedo. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready." They could hear Charles on stage, introducing the concert and explaining its charitable purpose to the audience. "Emily," Michael said suddenly, "there's something I wanted to tell you before we begin." "What?" "These have been the best rehearsals of my career. Thank you for that." She smiled. "They've been special for me too. And now, with great pleasure, I present Michael Reynolds and Emily Parker." Charles's voice echoed through the theatre. Applause began as they walked on stage. Emily moved confidently to the piano, her familiarity with the space evident. Michael took his place and waited for the applause to fade. "Good evening," he said into the microphone. "Before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about my partner tonight." Emily's heart raced. This wasn't planned. Emily Parker is one of the most talented pianists I've ever had the privilege to work with. She's taught me so much about music these past few days, but above all, she's taught me about courage. The audience listened in attentive silence. Emily has been blind for 3 years, the result of an accident. She could have given up music, but she chose to find a new way to connect with it. Tonight, you'll witness that physical limitations have nothing to do with artistic limitations. Emily felt tears streaming down her face, but kept her hands steady on the keys. "Our first piece is Puccini's Nessun Dorma." He nodded to Emily, who began the introduction. Her first notes rang through the theatre with a crystalline clarity that made the audience hold their breath. When Michael joined in with his voice, something magical happened. All the tension, all the fear, all the anxiety of the past days transformed into pure music. His voice had never sounded so expressive, and Emily's piano didn't just accompany him, it lifted every phrase to new emotional heights. The audience immediately realized they were witnessing something special. It wasn't just a technically flawless performance, It was a musical conversation between two artists who had found a common language. When the first piece ended, the applause was deafening. Emily felt a wave of relief and joy wash over her. They had done it. The second piece was Schubert's Ave Maria. This time Michael decided to take a risk. He improvised some melodic variations they hadn't rehearsed. To his delight, Emily followed him perfectly, crafting harmonies that made his improvisations even more expressive. In the audience, Margaret wept openly. Beside her, Charles smiled with pride. Rebecca, waiting for her turn to perform, shook her head in admiration. During the intermission, Emily and Michael left the stage to a standing ovation. Backstage, they were surrounded by fellow musicians and theatre staff. "Incredible," said Rebecca. "I've never seen a musical partnership blossom like that on stage." "How did you two achieve such perfect harmony?" another musician asked. Michael looked at Emily. "I think we stopped fighting against each other and started fighting together for the music." The second act included 3 more complex pieces, including Michael's favorite Conte Partiro. When he announced it, he made sure to look at Emily. "This final piece holds special meaning for me. It speaks of departures and reunions, of leaving something behind to find something new. This week I had to let go of old prejudices to discover a new way of making music." The introduction to Conte Partiro began slow and melancholic. Emily played with her eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music. Michael joined in with his voice, and from the first phrase it was clear this would be the most emotional performance of the night. As the piece progressed, building toward its climax, something extraordinary happened. Emily began improvising a subtle counter-melody with her right hand, something they had never rehearsed. Instead of faltering, Michael wove her melody into his interpretation, creating a spontaneous musical dialogue. The audience was spellbound. Many had tears in their eyes. In the crowd, a famous music critic scribbled furiously in his notebook. When they reached the final line, Conte Partiro, Michael and Emily slowed together as if they were a single musician. The last note echoed through the theatre, followed by a profound silence that lasted several seconds. Then the room erupted. The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted over 5 minutes. People shouted "Bravo!" clapped, some openly weeping. Michael took Emily's hand and led her to the front of the stage for their bows. When she curtsied, the applause grew even louder. "Thank you," Michael said into the microphone as the applause finally subsided. "You've just witnessed why I love making music so much, and why I'll never forget this night." Backstage, they were swarmed by admirers. Margaret was among the first to reach them. "My daughter," she said, hugging Emily tightly. "You soared tonight. You truly soared." The music critic approached and introduced himself as Robert Thompson from the American Music Journal. "Mr. Reynolds, Mrs. Parker, I just witnessed one of the most extraordinary performances in recent years. May I ask a few questions for my article?" "Of course," replied Michael. "How did you develop such musical harmony in such a short time?" Emily answered first. "I think it happened when we stopped trying to prove things to each other and started sharing our passion for music." "And, Mr. Reynolds, what was it like working with a blind pianist?" Michael carefully considered his response. "It was eye-opening. Emily taught me that musical vision has nothing to do with eyes. It's about the heart and the ears. She hears things in music I never noticed." "Do you plan to work together again?" Michael looked at Emily. "If she's willing, I'd love to." "It would be an honor," Emily replied. Later, after the crowd had dispersed and the theatre grew quiet, Emily and Michael sat on the empty stage, still in their concert attire. "So," Michael said, "how do you feel?" "Like I've come home after a long journey." "That's exactly how I feel too." They sat in silence for a few minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what they had just experienced. "Michael," Emily finally said, "can I ask you something?" "Anything." "On stage, when you said I taught you about courage, what did you mean?" He reflected before answering. "I always thought courage meant not being afraid. But you showed me that courage is doing what needs to be done despite the fear. And I learned something from you too." "What?" "That change is possible. That people can start one way and end another, if they're open to it." Do you think I've changed? Emily smiled. On the first day you sang to show off. Today you sang to connect. That's a huge change. Charles appeared on stage, carrying a bottle of champagne and 3 glasses. I thought you two deserved a special toast. They toasted to the night's success, but mostly to the unexpected friendship that had blossomed between them. Charles, Michael said, you were right from the start. Emily wasn't just competent, she was extraordinary. Sometimes you have to set aside pride to see the talent in others, the director replied. As they finally prepared to leave, Michael asked Emily one last question. Do you think we can do this again? Not just perform together, but truly create music together? I think that's what real musicians do, she said. They create something greater than the sum of their parts. So, until the next concert? Until the next concert. They said goodbye at the theater doors. Michael walked to his car but stopped and looked back one last time. Emily was being helped into a taxi by her mother, but there was a radiant smile on her face. For the first time in years, Michael Reynolds had found something he valued more than solo applause. He had found a true musical partner, and Emily Parker had proven to herself and the world that no limitation can hold back true talent when fueled by determination and passion. 3 months later, they were touring together across the United States, bringing music and inspiration to audiences of all ages. The benefit concert had raised enough funds to equip a new wing at Children's Hope Hospital, but more importantly, it had created a friendship and musical partnership that would last forever. Robert Thompson's review, published the day after the concert, ended with these words. Last night, we witnessed not just exceptional music, but a life lesson on how prejudice can be turned into respect and how apparent limitations can become extraordinary strengths when embraced with courage and determination. And Emily Parker, the girl who had lost her sight but found a new way to see the world through music, knew her true journey was only just beginning. The end. So, what did you think of this touching story? Tell us in the comments which part moved you the most, and if you've ever faced a similar situation of overcoming challenges. Don't forget to like if you enjoyed the story and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other inspiring tales like this one. Your opinion means a lot to us.